The presentation today is based on an essay that I wrote when I was working on Documenta called Outlawed Social Life. And like much of what I was writing about at the time and continue to do, kind of like to look at these moments in history where there were certain kinds of ruptures that took place and kind of look deeper at what people were doing and why they were doing it. But first, we'll begin with a song. So what you're listening to is a potlatch song, a song that would be sung during a potlatch. And one of the contradictions of the recording of many of these potlatch songs, especially those done by early ethnomusicologists like Ida Halperin, was on, and this was all along the northwest coast of Canada and the US, is that while it was okay for an ethnomusicologist to record the song, it was illegal to undertake the ceremony in which the song would have been sung. What you see in front of you is a speaking mask, hayaktatlo, and each family group has a dedicated person who is able to speak about the knowledges, about family privileges within that family. So this includes stories and so on that can be shared. And the mouth of this mask is open to enable oration. Umista and Nuambalis. These are both words in the Kwakwala language. And here you see Alert Bay in BC on a little inlet on the west coast of Canada. So these were names that were bestowed on two new cultural centers, one in Alert Bay, BC, and the other in Cape Mudge, which is near Campbell River. And these were founded, they were built specifically to house the mass and dance regalia repatriated after the potlatch ban was ended. And the potlatch ban lasted between 1855 and 1951 in Canada. In the US, where perhaps potlatches were seen as less of a threat, the ban was slightly shorter, but it was a ban nonetheless. The word Nuambalis means stories from the beginning of the world. And umista is a term given when something returns back to its place of origin. So it comes back home. In the past, people who came home after being taken captive during a raid were said to have umista. So that means it's also something you can embody. And although not normally used this way, the masks and the regalia that have come back to both Cape Mudge and Alert Bay, they also now have umista. And the objects at Nuambalis can once again tell their stories. In 1889, the German-American anthropologist Franz Boas, he interprets Alert Bay and the Kwakwaka'wakw people as existing on what he defined as Europe's outer edge. For him, they represented both the conceptual and geographic limit of the very edges of European civilization and its influence. And he had to travel far to find it. In the larger cities on Canada's west coast, he was disappointed because he felt like Native people there were already in European dress. And he considered them, and I quote the great scholar Christopher Bracken, totally other and yet the same at the same time. So Boas went farther up island and in his failed search for absolute difference from himself, and something that he would actively have to invent as much as discover so as to make the case that the Kwakwaka'wakw were not only at Europe's outer edge, but they were at the very boundary of European knowledge itself. And this limit, you could understand it as his own kind of intellectual limit, played itself out in different ways. And this was not a limit just limited to Boas, it was limited to all the settlers and all the lawmakers in colonial Canada at the time. So this limit played itself out in different ways, often through misunderstanding. And much of this revolved around the potlatch. And the potlatch became a kind of obsession for Indian agents and other people in governance. So in early European texts, these ceremonies, which each have their own name and their own individual characteristics, each of them have their own social functions, they were sometimes called medicine feasts. And this was pretty close to the actual intent of some potlatches, and that is to heal grief. The European authors understood that for Native people, healing was an irreducible part of the communal sharing of food and other goods. And the early spelling of potlatch with an A emerged first in quotations as though the namers were unsure of the name, struggling with what to call what they were witnessing. And whether the communal sharing of wealth, and you can see here all the goods that are intended to soon be gifted, was simply something of a gift, let's say, with no expectation for repayment, or whether it was an act of reciprocity, which is more complex. So given with the expectation that something was also to be received in return, was also a point of contention, because if it was indeed reciprocity, then it brought the practices of the so-called uncivilized uncomfortably close to that of civilized society, which necessitated that those in power busy themselves once again in generating more distance between this custom and European traditions, like Christmas, for example. Another motive for the ban was that in the months leading up to the ceremony, people were so occupied with the important task of making and accumulating things to give away, and this could take years as well, not just in the months leading, but years, as well as the making of new regalia, that they didn't take part in any other, and I quote, work or any other labor, like in the canneries, for example. Yet the labor generated by the potlatch ceremony was clearly also not on par through the eyes of Indian agents and other settlers with the labor of working in canneries or in other industrial pursuits. Potlatches also, and this is really important, set in motion a separate system of governance and social structure that colonizers could not really wrap their heads around, so it was not agreeable to them. So a leader gains and confers rank in the ceremony through displays of wealth, through the gifting of wealth, through enacting complex social contracts between hosts and guests, as well as the relationship between surplus and debt. And there was no room for these two systems of governance or two systems of wealth on the frontiers of colonialism. So as Christopher Bracken says, the thing called the potlatch is the point where the logic of colonialism comes to a crisis. These are the kind of crises that I'm interested in. So the ban came at the time of another anxiety, and this one was economic, because in 1884, there was a major recession taking place in British Columbia. And condemning the displays of wealth as particularly wasteful, as was competitive gift giving, which did take place as part of the potlatch. And that was for which the guest of a potlatch was then expected to respond with an even greater display of wealth during the next ceremony, essentially bankrupting the chiefs and the host community, was something that they could not tolerate. So meaning that the settlers and the Indian agents couldn't tolerate these displays. They couldn't tolerate this competitive gift giving and this kind of idea of bankruptcy because it didn't match with their ideas of capitalism. However, the social contract, and that is bound in the reciprocal bound of ceremony, ensured that this debt was paid back in the future with interest. So this means that everyone benefits over time and everyone actually gets more wealthy. Not wealthy in the capitalistic sense, but wealthy as broadly as we can understand it in terms of social systems, care, food, governance, justice system, all of those things involved. So this debt was paid back in the future with interest. And in the early 1900s, the potlatch also changed because of the influx of money, so paper money and coins. Native workers profited in industries including the fish canneries because they were really good at it. And they used this monetary wealth to purchase more things to give away, more and more things. So think of it, it was capitalism kind of making the potlatch system even more wealthy. So they purchased more things to give away, including blankets, furniture, motorboats, and other modern conveniences. I've heard of pool tables, for example. The Western economy then enabled the native one, and for Indian agents, this pushed it to new and intolerable limits. So these were the people on behalf of the government who were put into communities to kind of keep an eye on what was going on there, not for people's well-being, but actually just to enforce bans like the potlatch ban. It was all about colonial control. So in 1921, during the week of Christmas, Dan and Emma Kramer, and you heard Dan singing here at the beginning of the ceremony, hosted a 5-day ceremony in Village Island to enable Emma's family to repay the property that her husband had gifted when they were first married. So to give you a sense of the kind of complicated relations, I'll read that again. So they hosted the 5-day ceremony to enable Emma's family to repay the property that her husband gifted when they were first married. So you can see the reciprocity there. So in the largest group arrest to take place during the ban, 45 people were arrested and 22 of them were jailed. And in place of incarceration, they set up a plea deal by the defense that offered the surrender of masks, of coppers, which were their banks, regalia, and headdresses to the crown. So not just to Canada, but to the crown, along with the public renouncement of the potlatch. So they also had to renounce it publicly. So the surrender of material and the renouncement of the potlatch were not limited to those initially arrested, but extended to the entire 300 people taking part in the ceremonies. And sentences were handed out in neighboring communities as well, probably a bit ad hoc, because some of those people might not have been involved at all. So these arrests too were steeped in Christian ideologies. It was believed that they had renounced the gift, and their renunciation brought them over to the civilized side of the border between civilization and barbarity. So again, I think the settlers were pretty obsessed with what this boundary was, and it kept on shifting, so they kept on having to invent it anew. So once the name was settled for the potlatch, attempts to stop the practice began in earnest. And to cite Jacques Derrida, he says that to give a name is always, like any birth certificate, to sublimate a singularity and to inform against it, to hand it over to the police. And this is absolutely what happened with the potlatch. In 1884, amendments were made to Canada's Indian Act, of which we're still governed by, to officially ban the potlatch and to persecute those who were taking part or aiding in the ceremony. Amendments that consolidated the power to persecute, to judge, and to act as jury to the single individual, and that individual was the Indian agent. And the ban dictated that, and I quote from the Indian Act at that time in 1884, every Indian or other person who engages or assists in celebrating the Indian festival known as the potlatch, and again they put it in quotes, or the Indian dance known as tamanawas, is guilty of a misdemeanor and liable to imprisonment for a term of not more than 6 nor less than 2 months. And every Indian or person who encourages an Indian to get up to such a festival shall be liable to the same punishment. So policy, as Fred Moten reminds us, is often directed towards the poor and the dispossessed. Policy amendments come about in response to this failure of control. So the potlatch, despite the repeated dictate and assumption that it would simply die out, and its subsequent renunciation by Native peoples under duress, adopted new forms, and it carried on because it was malleable. So one of the first people to try and get back the regalia and the objects understood by all who know them as beings. So these are alive. That was why it was so hurtful when they were taken away in the first place, because those who took them away had no idea how to care for them. And this person was the late Chief James Seward. So in 1967, after initial conversations failed, he had to buy them because he wanted to buy them back for the same price that they originally sold to museums. However, it's not so simple because, as the late museologist Michael Ames once wrote, he said, once objects enter museums, they also become bound by museological protocols, which they then carry back with them when they're eventually returned to their place of origin. So this is one of the things that tags along with the act of repatriation. So the Royal Ontario Museum, for example, argued that so we'd not only pay the purchase price of the objects, but also for their care and restoration that they underwent while in the holdings of the museum. So these were clearly objects transformed. They carried with them the context of the museum and carried this back with them when they returned to both Cape Mudge and Alert Bay, context which predicated their display, their use, and their care, so their future care that when they were back home. At Umista Cultural Center in Alert Bay, which you see here, the belongings, and some of them, rightly so, are beings, are organized around both the edges of the room and in the center. They're on stands, they're not positioned behind glass cases. The order in which they are displayed roughly corresponds with their role in a potlatch. So when a character would be danced in a potlatch is also the way in which you see them here. In the center of the museum, and you can see these ones in the center are actually on a rolling pedestal. It's an open area for dance and ceremony. So the returned belongings can oversee the proceedings like sentinels, and perhaps they can also participate. The ownership that's on display at Noamboli's Cultural Center in Cape Mudge is actually more about familial heritage. It's about lineage. And the lineage not just of the people who were caretakers of the belongings, but the lineage of the mass and regalia themselves, as is the role of other high-ranking people in that 1921 potlatch where all these things were taken. I think that the objects returned exhibit something of a homesickness even now, because contained in their exile is a constant longing for reappropriation. Of all the photos of the confiscated items from Alert Bay, this one is the one that circulates most. Masks perform different roles in a potlatch. Of those in this picture, some are chief's headdresses, others are not worn but displayed at the appropriate time as a sign of rank, and the remainder are danced. In the center of this image is a transformation mask. It's created with elaborate pulley systems, and their wearers switch between different beings mid-performance, thus enacting or performing the thin line between the human and spirit worlds. Not just performing, but in fact, becoming. So here these masks are displayed in a fixed position with their interfaces exposed. And this will take place in the Anglican Church, by the way. The large mask shown in the lower left corner is a Zinokwa mask, or the wild woman of the woods. She's often carved with her mouth open and often adorned with a long mess of hair. She's a cannibal. She captures children in her cedar basket for later eating, but she's easy to trick, which you'll find out later. On the other side of the upper ledge are carved skulls, because representations of life and death are integral to potlatch ceremonies. And here's another photo of the masks lined up. And here's Zinokwa's counterpart. This is Bakwas. This is the wild man of the woods. And now for a musical interlude by the late chief Biliasu, and Biliasu was from Cape Mudge. that was another song that was recorded by Ida Halprin at a time when the singing of the song would have been illegal. So the cultural belongings that were taken during the raid on Village Island and surrounding communities, they're gathered together here like sinners in the Anglican Parish Church in Alert Bay. They were arranged on these white chiefs by the Indian agent William Halliday. And the mass and the photographs, to me anyway, are presented like evidence of supposedly fugitive practices. The photographs exist because of the ban, but they're another kind of evidence as well, and that is, of the white obsession with the potlatch. Because when the mass were shipped from Village Island to Alert Bay and assembled in the church, they became commodities. Before they were dispersed, viewers paid a small admission to view them on display in the parish hall. And they were treated with relative indifference in the 1860s, but by the 1870s, there was something of a moral crusade. They were now trafficable objects. They entered the holdings of museums via sales that Halliday himself took part in. They were sold to individuals such as George Gustav Hay, whose holdings formed the basis of the National Museum of American Indian, as well as the surrealist writer André Breton. A small number remained in the personal collection of another Indian agent named Duncan Campbell Scott. So while the agents themselves described the potlatch as worthless, the masks clearly were not. They were immediately ascribed a value. Taken from the hands of the rightful owners, they became commodities and later vessels for others to project their ideas of the supernatural on, particularly the surrealists did this, of both the primitive and, again, the surreal. They began to stand in for the limits of European knowledge. So in a way, Boas was right. Central to this picture are two large masks spread out that reveal three faces, two on the outside and one more human-like on the center. The masks are of the double-headed serpent. Always depicted with horns, the creature turns those who cannot face their own fears into stone. And perhaps in line with its double-headed nature, it also bestows both power and wealth. So warriors and chiefs still employ his image as a crest on their regalia for protection. Yet Halliday's evidence of fugitive practices included people too. In this photo, a chief holds two tlakwa, or coppers, both a whole and a partial piece. Tlakwa are cut for specific reasons, either as an act of shaming or to demonstrate the high chief who can afford to cut it, who might bestow a cut piece on the top of, or portion of the top of his copper to a primary rival. The largest copper in the collection has a name, Guayamacan, and the name of the copper means true whale, but its design looks also like a bird and it has a defined beak and ears, and the face of the copper is well worn and it makes it hard to interpret. It's been said that these kind of smooth face, or sometimes they call them white man's coppers, were worthless. However, its history indicates that in 1922, it was valued at $250, which conflicts with the value of the smooth-faced coppers. Or perhaps those doing the valuing had no idea of the value. So on April 16th, 1919, an Alert Bay man wrote a letter on behalf of Namgis First Nation to petition the potlatch ban. In it, he decided to try to appeal to Western economic models as a way of explaining the value of tlakwa. He said, each tribe has its own coppers and each copper has its own value. In the old days, there was no money and these coppers were a standard of value and they increased in value each time they changed hands. When the white man came and we could earn wages and cash for our labor, we invested our savings in our coppers and we used them the same way a white man would do with a bank. And we would always expect more back than we put in. So again, this idea of interest. We are giving you a list of the coppers belonging to the Namgis tribe and their values. Other tribes have their own coppers so that you will see the great financial loss that would entail on us if this custom is suppressed. His appeal didn't work, but I thought it was interesting the way that he was framing it, clearly, understanding their ideas of value, monetary value. So we can understand the tlakwas as doubly invested, both with cultural value and economic ones. And this value continued to accrue the more that the coppers circulated. This great investment didn't transfer when they were confiscated in 1922, however, and unlike the masks and regalia, no compensation was ever given to the owners of the coppers, even though this was the most valued thing, as they were not assigned a dollar value in Indian agent ledgers. But this didn't mean the potlatches stopped altogether, because during the ban, they went underground and their outward character was disguised. And at times, potlatch goods were given at Christmas time as presents, while in the 1930s, communities began hosting deliberately disjointed ceremonies. Dances and speeches were held on separate days from the distribution of goods, because gift giving was banned when undertaken in the context of ceremony. At other times, potlatches are modeled on the giving of relatively banal European goods. So here, 1,500 stacks of flour, for instance, in this image. So in place of the usual potlatch rituals that accompany distribution, when giving a sack of flour, here, the offerer simply said, "Here is some flour to help you over the hard winter." So Christian ideas of charity were also added to the ceremony to dispel any concerns over questionable behavior. This was a calculated decision, given that these Native communities had notoriously resisted assimilation to Christianity. Nevertheless, the choice provided the guise of conversion, while the communities quite transparently carried on their own spiritual practices. And when 900 sacks of flour were given away in Fort Rupert in 1933, the police were told this was simply an act of Christian charity. And how could they argue with that? So given the number of sacks implying the great wealth of the person who purchased them, their deliberate display beforehand, the communal gathering, this giving of flour was likely a means to repay a debt owed to another family, perhaps because of a recent marriage or a change of status, or to celebrate the birth of a child. So in this sense, the potlatch reframed brought about another crisis in colonial logic. Indian agents were well aware that this was a potlatch, yet their description and writing of the ceremony in their documents could not account for its changes in form and the inherent creative resistance. What the settlers had worked so hard to name had once again evaded their definition. Springing out of colonial shadows of language and law, the potlatch necessitated yet another correction and another form of control. So this mask you see here, his English name is Man-Eater at the north end of the world. It's a Hamatsa mask. And much of what's written about the Hamatsa ceremony, which is a secret society for many good reasons, is used as evidence of the savagery of Native people and further justification for the criminalization of the potlatch. It's originally held as part of winter ceremonials, and really it's for young men to enter manhood, so that transition from child to man. Over the course of the ceremony, the young men are rid of the spirit of the dead, and the Hamatsa was central for Kwakiwak to reiterate the power of a living relative over the dead. So within it, there is a theatrical consummation of the dead while you're doing it, but you're not succumbing to death yourself. So you sort of show power over that. And by doing so, you're also able to control some of the wild forces of nature. But there's another form of reciprocity at work here as well, that being the human world, that being between the human world and the supernatural. While spirits are sacrificed to enable the survival of human life as part of the ceremony, the very offering of human life signaled through the simulated eating of flesh is understood as necessary to enable the ongoing survival of the supernatural. So it's not just about the living, it's not just about us, it's also about the survival of the supernatural. Here's a man dressed in the church where those photos were taken. Yet the ceremonies of the potlatch brought forward another form of possession as well, that of the Indian agents and perhaps even the anthropologist Franz Boas himself. So here, Boas is seen modeling for a diorama of the Hamatsa ceremony. He is depicted as the wild dancer emerging from the threshold of the supernatural and out of the mouth of the man-eater at the north end of the world. And this diorama itself was based on an enactment of a ceremony that was very much out of time. And Aaron Glass writes about this very well. In 1893, a group of Kwakwaka'wakw were brought to Chicago as part of the World Columbian Exposition. And here they performed a portion of the Hamatsa over and over and over again to an uninitiated audience, setting in motion a cycle of repetition and reiteration of the ceremony that continues through to the present. So here's more of that photo shoot with Boaz in, increasing stages of undress. So the ceremonies of the potlatch brought about another form of possession, and here you see it enacted by Boaz himself. So in a way, he very much wanted to become the other. And his face, it's Boaz's face, and some anthropologists will know that is actually the basis for all of the models at the Museum of Natural History at a certain point in time. Because he felt at a certain point, and he wrote this, that he could perform the ceremonies as well or better than Native people themselves, not understanding that it's not about a performance. So the Kwakwaka'wakw people make clear, and this is from the opening ceremonies of both the Umista Cultural Center and the museum in Cape Mudge. So Kwakwaka'wakw people make clear that dance is not only a celebration, it's also an integral part of the judicial system and governance. They declare that a strict law bids us dance. A strict law bids us dance. So in 1975, when the return of the first set of cultural belongings taken after the potlatch of 1921 was made official, people in both Cape Mudge and Alert Bay celebrated with dances that were not simply celebratory. Part of the agreement for the objects to return home was that they had to be housed in museums with specific conditions. And with this came an opportunity for the community to rethink the role of the museum and how it might display objects and present their complicated stories. So at Umista Cultural Center in Alert Bay, they're arranged around an open area, and that's what you saw on the architecture of a big house, or some people call a longhouse on the West Coast. They're not placed in vitrines, but out in the open. And emphasis placed on the meanings of different belongings and the regalia and the continual reiteration of their relationship to the 1921 potlatch. And once again, at Nuwambalese and Cape Mudge, the emphasis on the display is on the lineages of the things themselves. So I wanted to tell you another story about this image, and it's one that you've seen before. And this is from the writing of Chief Robert Joseph, or as he's known as Bobby Joe. And he writes that in a bid to stamp out the Aboriginal people in our culture, the Canadian government enacted a law in 1884 prohibiting the potlatch during the Atlakim dance, or the forest dance, which I took part in. I remember a confusing interruption. Someone announced the arrival of unexpected visitors, and everyone scrambled from the big house out into the night. My memory fails me somewhat because I was a little boy. My next recollection is that we were reassembled in the big house, still in full dress for the Atlakim posting for photographs. And I remember a policeman in uniform being there. No charges were laid, even though anti-potlatch statute was still in full effect. My people were operating covertly to sustain their traditions, values, and beliefs, to which the mask is so integral. And the Kwakwaka'wakw were persecuted more than any other First Nation under this law. Both leaders, men and women, were jailed, masks were confiscated, big houses were torn down, ceremonial objects were burned. But in spite of this, a higher law commanded that we continue to dance. And he goes on to say that while very few older masks and pieces of art survived in our communities, our artists created replacements that allowed us to maintain and continue our dance and ceremony, primarily through the use of masks. And during this dark period of cultural repression, collectors came and pillaged many of the last remaining great objects from another time. Contemporary art became commercial art, he says. And this was at first a glaring setback. The art form became the medium that held the ceremony and ritual together while we awaited our cultural renaissance. Despite the predictions of authorities and policymakers that the potlatch would disappear, which at the height of the ban were constantly repeated by policymakers and by the accused as a way to placate the authorities, the potlatch never died. As a system, it proved remarkably malleable. At times, it was split into two parts, strategically incorporating European goods and ideologies as a disguise or going underground while remaining very much itself. And potlatch objects circulate now mostly in the form of masks, some carved specifically for the art market, and others only as ceremony. Bo Dick, the late artist, is a maker of masks. Of Kwakwaka'wakw descent, he used to live and he worked in Alert Bay. And the frequent subject of his carvings, many of which are sold to collectors, is Zunokwa, so the cannibal woman. In this context, eating the other is a stand-in for cultural consumption. And in 2012, he tried to short-circuit this desire for consumption when he removed 40 of his masks from the wall of his commercial gallery in Vancouver. He took them back to his home community, and they were ceremonially danced and then burned in front of witnesses that included both those living in Alert Bay, as well as invited guests, as well as artists, collectors, and his own gallerists. And the burning of the masks was not a simple act of destruction, but it in fact is the thing necessary to set in motion the creation of new masks, which after their 4 years or 4 times of being danced in ceremony, they'll be also set ablaze. So there's a story about a community of people who decided to do something about Zunokwa. So they captured her and they killed her. To ensure that she wouldn't come back to life, they built a huge fire to burn her body. But at the moment that her body was scorched and turning black into char, she transformed into a swarm of mosquitoes. So the transformation and dispersion of Zunokwa was something like the potlatch itself, a practice that survives because of its own transmutations during the apex of colonial violence and control. And here's an honoring of Bo Dick's mass by his 2 apprentices, Cole Speck and Alan Hunt, during the opening of Documenta 14 in Athens, Greece. And I'll end there. Thanks everyone for listening.